Hello and welcome back to Dwarf Fortress. In my last video, I went on a couple adventures to spread weremammoth and vampire curses to random dwarves living in one of the civilizations in my world, so that I could finally experience the joy of having to deal with night creatures in fortress mode for the first time in a couple years. After ending that video by confirming that my baby weremammoths would be included in migrant waves to future fortresses, I began thinking about how exactly I wanted to turn the problem I had created for myself into an interesting fortress. And in the end, I settled on an idea for a challenge. Build as big of a fortress as possible while relying solely on my weremammoth migrants for defense. No trap hallways, no indefinitely locked doors, and no dwarf soldiers. Just a good old-fashioned full moon militia answering the bell each time a new enemy appeared. Of course, I wouldn't be able to use weremammoths for much of anything if they were busy destroying my fortress and devouring their fellow citizens each full moon, so I needed a way to identify them and keep them separate from the rest of my citizens. Which is why, when I set out to build the fortress of monstrous soldiers, I immediately dropped my population cap to 7 so that I wouldn't be surprised by any cursed migrants, and put my dwarves to work setting up workshops, farms, and accommodations for my full-time dwarves, and sorting rooms, a holding room, and a secret path to the surface for my future part-time weremammoths. A couple years after embarking, once everything was pretty much ready to go, I raised the population cap and got ready to begin the sorting process. When our first migrant wave finally arrived, I placed each migrant in their own isolation squad as soon as they entered the map, and then assigned each of those squads to their own sorting room. Once all the new dwarves were safely in position, the sorting rooms were locked off with the flick of a lever, and then all I had to do was wait for the next full moon to see if any of my migrants were cursed. And sure enough, in the first wave, 2 dwarves sprouted tusks. While everyone else was freed from duty and released into the fortress, the 2 weremammoths were made the first members of the full moon militia and were sent down to the holding room, which then got locked off from the rest of the fortress. Once I had confirmed that the fortress was safe even when things got woolly in the holding room, all I had to do to continue building up the militia was precisely repeat everything I had just done every season until someone gave me an opportunity to bust out some defensive weremammoth maneuvers. So that's what I did, migrant wave after migrant wave, until 45 dwarves were living in the fortress, 5 of which were cursed. Unfortunately, with such limited space in the holding room, my 5 weremammoths were having a hard time living up to the wiki's assurance that werebeasts of the same type are able to peacefully coexist, as they started taking occasional swings at one another while coming out of their weremammoth forms. In the moment, I thought that there might just be a frame or two where one of my weremammoths was still transformed while the other had returned to normal, leading to a moment of violence. But with the power of hindsight, aka spending some time reading the wiki, I think that the problem was actually that I was forgetting to remove the station order I had given to the militia to get them to stay in the holding room. The wiki says having an active squad order during transformation time will make your werebeasts want to kill one another, which is actually a phenomenon I experienced in a fortress a few years ago. But I guess I got lucky because things never escalated beyond some playful scratching and light gouging in my fortress. I didn't know any of that at the time, however, so based on my assumptions and the feeling I had that my militia was always one bad transformation away from completely collapsing, I felt like I had to raise the enemy difficulty so that I would at least have a chance to fight somebody before my army imploded, and I put my normal dwarves to work building individual holding rooms, so that eventually my weremammoths could be prevented from swiping at one another, active squad order or no. Soon after I raised the enemy difficulty, my wish was granted and we had our first challenger pop up at our door, a small elf ambush armed with wooden weapons, which is pretty much the perfect warm-up for a weremammoth militia. I temporarily locked the front door of the fortress so that I could wait for the full moon to draw near before I released my monsters, which was bad news for the fisher dwarf who was stuck outside. Once the full moon was just a few days away, I released my militia and sent them to fight the elves, Only it turned out that I was a little bit too eager with my timing, and my dwarves had to spend a full day getting battered before they finally transformed. But once they did, their wounds were healed, and they eviscerated the small elf ambush in a couple seconds. They were a little dazed once the full moon was over, and they were confronted with the horrors of what they had done, but it only took a couple weeks to get all 5 of them locked up back in the holding room safe and sound, which meant that I could tick off our first fight as a total success. 6 months and 1 weremammoth added to the militia later, we had a second challenger pop in for an ambush. This time, it was a couple dozen elves, with hordes of war elephants, tigers, horses, and mandrills in tow. Once again, I locked the front door of the fortress and waited for the full moon to approach, but this time I managed to time my militia's release nearly perfectly. Even so, the fighting was tough. My weremammoths struggled against the war elephants whenever they were unable to surround them, 2 of my weremammoths died in the battle, and there were even some random horses left alive at the end of the full moon. But as the remains of the elf ambush turned tail and ran off the map when given the opportunity, there was no way to consider the battle anything but another victory for my full moon militia. The third challenger that we had to deal with was the Minotaur Isa Thunderstruck, though the situation with her was a bit of a mystery at the time. She arrived in our territory shortly after we welcomed a small migrant wave into the sorting rooms, so when I locked the front door of my fortress to stop her from getting in, I planned on using the upcoming full moon to test my migrants, and then the next full moon to take her down. But while I was watching over my sorting rooms, I noticed that there was a fight taking place between the Minotaur and a mysterious weremammoth that was not affiliated with my fortress. I saw the combat notification pretty quickly after it appeared, so I tried to locate the weremammoth on the surface. And when that failed, I searched the creature lists and came up empty again. It wasn't until I was able to use Legends mode that I could confirm that Zaineg Haimrouts was one of the baby weremammoths I had infected on my adventure, and that she just so happened to be an independent were-invader skulking around my territory at the same time as the Minotaur. The fact that she would have been perfectly willing to kill my dwarves instead of the Minotaur if things had played out slightly differently, and that fighting her with my own weremammoths would have been impossible due to werebeast solidarity, probably means that I shouldn't chalk this one up as a victory, but a weremammoth did happen to defend the fortress against an external threat, so I think it counts as at least half a success for my experiment. Unfortunately, our good luck ran out with the arrival of the 4th challenger, a small goblin siege with full metal equipment and solid skills with their chosen weapons. Due to their request to parley, I was able to position my 4 remaining weremammoths within their ranks a few days before the full moon, but the element of surprise didn't seem to do us much good, because when they finally transformed, things didn't go very well. Because one of the conditions of the challenge was that I couldn't leave doors locked indefinitely, I had to open up our front gates once the last of my weremammoths perished, which I thought would be the end of the fortress. But it turned out that my weremammoths had taken out just enough goblins that the flood of civilians who came out to clean up the mess were able to overwhelm what was left of the siege. I considered retiring the fortress anyway, given how hopeless the situation was, but without a total collapse, I felt obligated to at least try to rebuild my weremammoth militia and keep things going. Only for the 5th challenger, an even larger goblin siege, this time with beak dogs, to appear a couple months and a mere 2 weremammoths added to the squad later. Sending out the militia was obviously hopeless, but the rules of the challenge forced my hand, and when my weremammoths were killed instantly, I had no choice but to open up the front doors of the fortress too. And this time, while only the beak dogs had any interest in going into the fortress, my civilians were the ones that were overwhelmed. Monstrous soldiers ultimately peaked at a population of 53, and the largest the full moon militia ever got was 6. So if you like the idea of using a werebeast military in your fortress, I would recommend reading the werebeast military section of the werebeast wiki page, because I didn't until after I was done recording the footage for this video, and it is super helpful and informative. But if you happen to have an abundance of werebeast migrants, and the low effort stylings of my full moon militia appealed to you, I recommend settling down somewhere where your only neighbors are elves. That way you can really maximize the carnage. At the end of the day, my fortress may have collapsed, and my challenge may have resulted in the deaths of dozens of innocent dwarves, but I did actually manage to reduce the number of weremammoths in my world by 8 along the way. So really, I think my dwarves should probably still be thanking me. Thanks for watching, an extra thank you to those of you who support me on Patreon, and I'll see you next time.